research fellow. Sorry. Thank you for starting the recording. So yes, I was saying my name is Ruth Wade and I'm a research fellow in the regenerative farming systems at the University of Leeds in the biology department. I joined the University of Leeds in November 2021 as part of a larger programme called Fix Our Food, which aims to understand how to steward system transformation towards a regenerative food system. As this is a really large aim, the project focuses on Yorkshire as an exemplar region, and at the University of Leeds, we lead the regenerative farming systems work package of this Fix Our Food programme. So if you want to find out more about the work we do on regenerative agriculture, please visit the GFEI YouTube channel, because there's lots of videos and a previous seminar of mine focusing on our regenerative agriculture work. So today it is my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar of the Global Food and Environment Institute. This title of the talk today is Planting Hedgerows Across England, Soil and Biomass Carbon Sequestration for Climate Change Mitigation, which will be presented by Pippa Chapman and Sofia Biffi. So Professor Pippa Chapman is a soil scientist and holds a chair in biogeochemistry in the School of Geography at the University of Leeds. After completing her PhD at Imperial College, Pippa moved to the James Hutton Institute in Aberdeen, where she held a NERC fellowship before moving to the University of Leeds, where she has focused her research on improving our understanding on how peatland restoration, land use change, and agricultural practices affect soil processes and nutrient cycling and subsequent impact on air and water quality. Recently, she has focused on quantifying the benefits provided by increasing hedgerow planting in agricultural landscapes, in particular climate change mitigation, flood alleviation, and biodiversity. She's also working with myself on the Fix Our Food project, evaluating the impact of regenerative agriculture on food production, farm profit, and the environment. And she's also working with colleagues in the School of Earth and Environment at the University of Leeds and AFBI on the Northern Ireland Soil Health and Nutrient Scheme. Dr Sofia Biffi is a postdoctoral environmental scientist at the University of Leeds. Her research falls within agroecology, and she is interested in agri-environment schemes, impact and uptake, soil properties in sustainable management systems, and insect and bird farmland biodiversity. After completing her PhD in biology on sustainable soil management for farmland birds in 2020, she has been working as a postdoctoral researcher at the School of Geography for the Resilient Dairy Landscape project, the Best Map Horizon 2020 project, and for the ICASP project. Her main focus has been assessing the changes in soil carbon stocks, hydrology and biodiversity with hedgerow planting schemes across the UK. She is also working on large-scale data analysis of industry-collected data to assess the potential for monitoring soil organic carbon stock changes with farming practices. So, the Global Food and Environment Institute is an interdisciplinary research community which brings together members from across academia, industry, and public policy to work on the integrated challenges of food security and climate change. If you want further information, please visit the GFEI website at www.leeds.ac.uk/global food. The seminar is part of a series of seminars, so please also check out the chat function with the link to our series advertised on TicketSource website and our Twitter feed at Global Food Leeds for more information. So just the last thing before I introduce Pippa and Sofia, I would just like take this opportunity to remind you of seminar etiquette. Please ensure that your cameras and microphones are switched off for the duration of the seminar. The presentation will take around 20 minutes, during which please use the chat function addressed to everyone with your questions. And at the end of the presentation, there will be around 10 minutes Q&A session where I will collate the questions from the chat function and pose them to Pippa and Sofia. Just want to remind you that the seminar is being recorded and a recording will be made available via YouTube. So without further ado, I would now like to introduce you to Professor Pippa Chapman and Dr Sofia Biffi. Thank you.
Thanks, Ruth, for the introduction, and welcome everyone to this webinar where we're going to talk to you about the research we've been doing at the University of Leeds on the role of planting hedgerows, or the role that planting hedgerows can make to climate change mitigation and net zero targets. And this is because there's been lots of discussion about how hedgerow planting can contribute to climate change committee. And there's been a whole range of targets set over the last few years. And this is just a few of the main ones. So recently, DEFRA announced their target to increase hedgerow length by 73,000 kilometres by 2050. And then prior to that, the Climate Change Committee had proposed an increase in 40% could make a contribution to our net zero targets. And 40% increase in England, across England, will represent just under 200,000 extra kilometres of hedgerows. And to put this into context, that represents about half the length of our British road system today. It would also represent about half the length of hedgerows that were lost between 1984 and 2007. And we do have space for these hedgerows. If we increased hedgerows by 40%, it would just take up about 11% of current field boundaries within arable and grassland systems. We should also say that Natural England also had a very, ambitious target to increase hedgerow lengths for biodiversity gain. So, moving on. So in this presentation, Sophia and myself are going to cover four main areas. So in order to be able to work out the contribution that some of these targets can make to climate change, we need to know how much carbon is being stored and sequestered into soils beneath hedgerows. We need to know more about how much carbon is sequestered into hedgerow biomass. And then we can work out how much CO2 could be sequestered by planting additional hedgerows and look at these targets. And then lastly, we'll take a look at our current planting rates of hedgerows and the progress we're making towards these targets. So I'm going to cover the first bit, and Sophia will take over and cover the three other sections. So how much carbon is sequestered into the soils beneath hedgerows by planting hedgerows? And so over the last few years, we've been carrying out, we started in Cumbria, but we then progressed to looking at hedgerows in Yorkshire and Sussex. So we've looked at 3 regions, and in each of these regions, we've looked at hedgerows and adjacent fields on different geologies. So in Cumbria, the geologies were alluvium, and silts and sandstones. In Yorkshire, we looked at clay, boulder clay, and limestone. And in Sussex, the geologies that we looked at were chalk and the green sands. And so across these regions, we sampled in total 78 pairs of hedgerows and fields. And that's because we sampled to 50 centimetre depth at 10 centimetre intervals beneath the hedgerow. And then in the adjacent, predominantly grassland fields, we went out to about 15 to 30 metres into the field and took a subsequent soil core down to 50 centimetres. And we compared the carbon in these soil cores between the hedgerow and the field. And we looked at 4 categories of hedge age. So the younger hedgerows that have been recently planted and less than 5 years. We looked at hedgerows that are around 10-year-olds. We had another group of hedgerows where they ranged between 20 and 40 years. And then we had a range of hedgerows which were older, and in many cases, they were hundreds of years old. And as I said, we compared predominantly to improved grasslands in the adjacent field. So what did we find? So this graph shows the carbon stocks in brown that were in the grassland, the agricultural fields, in comparison to the carbon stocks that we found beneath the hedgerows, which are the green box and whisker pots. And what you can see is across the 6 areas, we have different carbon stocks, which you might expect because we have different climates, we've got different geologies, And we can see that in all the areas, the carbon stock beneath the hedgerows were higher on average than the carbon stock in the adjacent fields. But what we observed is that actually the difference between the carbon stock in the fields and below the hedgerows was similar for all these regions. And that was that on average, we found that beneath the hedgerows, there was an additional 40 tonnes of carbon per hectare in comparison to the adjacent grasslands. And this didn't matter if we were in Sussex on the green sands, or in Cumbria on the silts and sandstones, or Yorkshire on the limestone. It didn't seem to make a difference. It was the difference was very consistent despite the carbon stocks being different between these regions. And so when we then look at the carbon profile within the soil with depth, we see that for the younger hedgerows, so here we call them less than 10 years, there was a significant difference between the carbon stock in the top 20 centimetres of the soil profile. And then below that, it was similar between the grassland field and under the hedge. Whereas when we looked at the older hedgerows, above 20 years old, and up into those very old hedgerows I mentioned at hundreds of years, we found that there was a significant difference in the carbon stock between the hedgerow and the adjacent field, down to a depth of 40 centimetres. So we can see with age and time, the difference in the carbon stock is seen to deeper within the soil profile than when the younger hedgerows are planted. And then we looked at, because we've put our hedges into age categories, we could look at how carbon built up under these hedges as they increased in age. And this is just for one of the Cumbrian areas that we've looked at in detail. And what you can see here is these bar charts are the additional carbon that are beneath the hedges of those ages compared to the adjacent grasslands. So, for instance, the grasslands fields contained about 125 tonnes of carbon per hectare, and then the young hedgerows contained an additional 10 or 11 tonnes of carbon per hectare. And then by the time the hedgerows had been there for 10 years, we're seeing that the additional carbon under the hedgerow had increased to 27 tonnes of carbon per hectare. And then by the time we get to 37, 38-year-old hedges, we see an additional 54 tonnes of carbon under the hedgerows. And then we see, as we go further into the older hedgerows, the build-up in carbon is much smaller. So what we can see is we get the build-up of carbon in the soil happens more rapidly in the first 50 years than subsequently. But we do see that the carbon stocks do increase as the hedgerow becomes older, and that's particularly said in those first 50 years. So when we talk about carbon within the soil, the carbon can exist within different forms, and that particularly there's two very different forms of carbon. And there's the particulate organic matter, which mainly comes from plant residues, so the litter, the dying vegetation as it's returned as the leaf litter, or also root turnover. It tends to be lighter, it's got a complex carbohydrate structure, but it tends to be more vulnerable to decomposition by microbial population, but it can also be protected within soil aggregates. But again, these soil aggregates, if they're disturbed through maybe tillage, can be broken up, and this organic matter is vulnerable to disturbance and obviously decomposition and return the CO2 to the atmosphere. And then we have the mineral associated organic matter, and this tends to be passed through the microbial population, tends to be heavier, it's less complex, and it absorbs very rapidly onto iron minerals within the soil. And this organic matter is then protected from microbial decomposition and can remain within the soil from hundreds to thousands of years. So they have different sort of protection from decomposition, and they have different stabilities within the soil. So we then characterized our soil into these different pools of carbon. And we've got the heavier particulate organic matter, which is protected by aggregates, and the lighter particular organic matter, which is tends to be the litter that's available within the soil. And what we saw was actually, when you look at the differences in these carbon pools between the hedgerow and the field, it's actually the light particulate organic matter that really increases under the hedgerows. And here it's like nearly 200% greater under the hedgerows compared to the fields. And it's really the presence of the hedgerow that's continuously putting litter back into the soil beneath those hedgerows that's why we see a build-up of this particulate organic matter. And this trend was observed across all the locations, the 6 locations that we visited, and is also the same for nitrogen as well as carbon. And we also see it with depth through the soil profile. And this is very similar to some results that were published earlier in the year by Ezzy et al. In a meta-analysis, where they looked at how particulate organic carbon changed as a result of land use. And that was where we had agricultural soils, and they planted either agroforestry or changed it to grassland or planted it with trees. And what they found, and their results is the dashed line compared to ours, which is the solid line, is that where you saw this change in effect size of the particulate organic carbon, you also had a relationship with the total soil organic carbon stock increase. So it seems that initially, when you get land use change, or you hear where we plant hedges, the initial increase in carbon is very much related to this particulate organic matter fraction. And so now I'm going to pass to Sophia, who will tell you about carbon sequestration up into the biomass. So over to you, Sophia.
Thank you. So as Pippa showed you, we worked out how much soil organic carbon is stored under hedgerows across England. And now that we know how much carbon is stored in the soil, we wanted to know how much carbon is instead stored above ground in the biomass. And the above ground biomass of a hedge is its most visible part, but we had very little data about the carbon stock associated to it. And importantly, we really lacked a picture of what happens to the biomass carbon stock from hedge planting to maturity. And this more complete picture would then allow us in turn to work out how much carbon overall could be sequestered by planting hedges throughout the country. So we set off to measure this timeline of biomass carbon stock. And to do this, we worked with 5 of the farmers located in Cumbria, who very kindly let us destructively sample some small sections of their hedges. And we had an expert hedge layer, Rob Hogarth, who harvested all of the wood in a known volume of these hedges. And then he passed this woody biomass through a wood chipper so that we could collect the wood chip, dry, weigh it, and measure how much carbon was stored in it. So what came out of that is that, unsurprisingly, older hedges store a lot more above ground biomass carbon than younger ones. So 12-year-old hedges store over twice as much as younger hedges, and old hedges store again twice as much carbon as 12-year-old ones. What happens, however, in terms of sequestration is that after a hedge is planted, it is usually just left to grow. So it keeps growing. Maybe there is some occasional minor trimming. And then around the 12 to 15 year mark, it goes through its first management cycle. So at this point in time, the hedge usually gets laid or coppiced, and most of its biomass is removed. So knowing the age of these hedges that we sampled, we can then calculate the carbon sequestration rate of a hedge from planting to 6 years old, and then from 7-year-old to 12-year-old. And here I am showing the sequestration rate for hedges that are 1.5 meters wide, which is the DEFRA prescribed width for hedgerow planting in England. And then a hedge does again what it does best, and it just keeps growing again. And because we have laid this hedge in the past, it is structurally more dense than it used to be. And maybe we also allow to let it grow a little bit wider and a little bit taller. And another span of time goes by. And during this time, we operate some sort of regular management where we trim the hedge to keep it at a certain size and shape. And then after a certain number of years, it's time to go through a second cycle of management and lay the hedge again. So here we're at the second stage of the management cycle, this very simplified management cycle. And what we can see is that the second cycle has a biomass sequestration potential that is much smaller, because most of the potential has already been taken up during the first cycle of management of the hedgerow. However, because we did increase the density of the wood, of the hedge by laying it or coppicing it, and we also maybe left it grow a little bit taller, there is still carbon sequestration rate that is associated to hedgerows that are older than 12 years, even if it's much smaller than younger hedgerows. So now we have a picture of what happens to the above ground carbon sequestration from the moment of planting to hedgerow maturity. And then we have a measure of the soil organic carbon sequestration for around 40-year-old hedges that is coming from the work that Pippa talked about earlier. And there's still a piece of the puzzle that is missing, and that is below ground biomass. And in our study, we did not look directly at below ground biomass, but luckily we know how below ground and above ground biomass relate to each other because of some work that has been done by our colleagues in the UK and in Germany. And based on this relationship, we can estimate with our measurements what is the carbon sequestration rate of below ground biomass for 40-year-old hedges. So now we have all of the elements that we need to look at how much carbon we can sequester by planting hedgerows across England. So here I am considering two scenarios. In the first scenario, we have reached the climate change committee goal of planting 40% more hedgerows across England by 2050. And instead, in the second scenario, we have reached what was the DEFRA goal of planting 45,000 miles, so 73,000 kilometers of hedgerows by 2050. The climate change committee scenario would result in 10 megatons of CO2 being stored in the soil and in the biomass, both above ground and below ground, of this hedgerow 40 years down the line. And instead, the DEFRA scenario would store around 4 megatons of CO2 in the soil and in the biomass 40 years down the line. And because we know what is the estimated CO2 annual emission from agriculture in England, which is 5.6 megatons, we can calculate the offset, the annual offset of these two scenarios. So in the first scenario, if we plant 40% more hedges, we can offset 4% of the annual agricultural emissions by agriculture every year for 40 years. And instead, if we reach the DEFRA planting goal, we will offset 2% of the annual agricultural emissions every year for 40 years. Where are we now? We looked at the planting that has been done within the countryside stewardship and the environmental stewardship, because this data is publicly available and because these are the major funding bodies for hedgerow planting in the country. And we found that since 2004, these agro-environment schemes have planted over 5,200 kilometers of hedgerows, mostly around arable and improved grassland fields. And you can really see that there is a spike in recent years where that suggests that there has been really a strong increase in hedgerow planting efforts by farmers and landowners in the country. And it's also really important to notice that it's not just hedgerow planting per se that contributes to this. but also hedgerow restoration, gapping up. And we can see that for the past, so that's shown in blue in the graph, and for the past couple of years, gapping up has represented 30% of total planting efforts. So it's a very substantial contribution and should be taken into account. Hedgerow planting rates, however, are far too low still to reach the targets that we have set in time. So to give you an idea, if we wanted to reach a climate change committee goal of planting 40% more hedges at the same rate as we have been doing in 2022, it would take over 100 years. And that has been our highest planting rate yet. So very briefly, I wanted to show you what the scenario looks like if we just keep planting hedges at the same rate as we have been doing now. So by 2050, we will have planted around 45,000 kilometers of hedges, which would correspond to around 3 megatons of CO2 being stored in hedge biomass above ground, below ground, and in the soil 40 years down the line. And this would equate to offsetting only 1% of annual agricultural emission every year for 40 years. So planting hedges and gapping up hedges are really key for the climate change mitigation of hedgerows. So to wrap things up, what have we found so far is that in terms of soil organic carbon, we found that hedges throughout the country, throughout England, store an additional 40 tons of carbon per hectare more than predominantly grassland fields. And that this additional stock is actually quite uniform across regions. And we also found that this carbon stock is very rapidly lost if the hedges are removed, because most of the additional carbon stock is stored in the particular organic matter. In terms of above ground biomass carbon stocks instead, we showed what is the timeline of sequestration from hedgerow planting to hedgerow maturity. And we also showed that during this timeline, the sequestration potential rapidly decreases after a hedge goes through its first management cycle. But very importantly, management is essential to both soil organic carbon stocks and biomass carbon stocks, because it keeps the sequestration rate going and it keeps existing carbon stocks in place. And when it comes instead to the potential for hedgerow planting, our results really show that planting hedges and maintaining existing ones is a tool for climate change mitigation, and that by planting hedges, we could offset between 2 to 4% of annual agricultural emissions, depending on the target that we reach. But very importantly, we need to increase our planting efforts substantially if we're wanting to reach these targets. So thank you for listening. I have listed here our contact details, both emails and Twitter. Please reach out. We're always happy to discuss our results. And I have also listed the 2 papers that have already been published on the subject. There's a couple more down the pipeline, so looking forward to that. And I have also copied here the link to a blog post that we wrote for GFEI, where we discuss our current results today. And there's also a link to our to a leaflet that summarizes our results. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sophia and Pippa. Fantastic talk, really clear and very interesting. And we already have some questions in the chat. So I will just my screens out. So the first one we have was the contribution of newly planted hedgerows assumes that all newly planted hedges are still alive. Is there a way of measuring this and taking into account the hedges which are removed or neglected?
Hedges staying alive is crucial, and unfortunately, there's not really publicly available data on the amount of hedges that we lose. So that's definitely something that that we would want to know, also because there's a lot of public spending, of course, going into planting these hedgerows.
Yeah, I think it's a challenge. I think it's the same with planting trees, and particularly with climate change and the more sort of extreme events, particularly droughts occurring perhaps in the autumn or the spring when we're planting our hedgerows. It's definitely a challenge for all planting of all hedgerows and trees going forward into the future. So this isn't being recorded currently, and is challenging data to collect, I think, but it is something that we're aware of.
Yeah, great question. Thank you. And if you do have any questions, please put them in the chat, and I'll try and get through as many as we can in the time we have left. So the next one is, are there any initiatives or policies being discussed to promote the hedgerow planting goal to be implemented in other countries?
Well, there are goals in other countries, and we've looked at this. So it's not, and I should say, it's not just from a climate change benefit. Obviously, here we have focused on the climate change mitigation potential of planting hedgerows. But as I think someone in the chat mentioned, hedgerows have multiple benefits. And I think, that's why they are promoted within agri-environment schemes. And that's across Europe. Planting hedgerows are promoted in agri-environments across all of Europe. But also, many countries have committed to increasing tree planting, agroforestry and hedgerows within their climate change mitigation or sort of net zero targets. So we're not the only country that have set targets. I don't know, Sophia, if you want to say anything else.
Yeah, no, you covered it. So I know there's targets in France, in Germany, in Belgium, in Ireland. The climate change committee goal is definitely one of the most ambitious targets. It's also not an official target. Of course, the DEFRA goal is more within the lines of what other countries have been setting as well as a goal.
Excellent, thank you. And another great question, do you think the estimations of biomass carbon sequestration in hedges would change in different areas of the country?
It's hard to say, of course, without checking. We have little work so far that has been done on below ground biomass, but there is work. So there is our colleague Axe here in the UK has looked at it previously, and someone in Germany, Sophie Drexler, has very recently published a paper where she looked at the entire below ground biomass stock of hedgerows, and they came out very similar. So if they're quite similar between the UK and Germany, I would actually expect them to be fairly predictable and not so dependent on the region. But we don't really know how much it would change based on soil depth, for example. That's something that can change quite drastically between pedoclimatic conditions. So more to look into.
Yeah, and I think I should have noted really that all the work we did was on predominantly hedgerows that were predominantly hawthorn and blackthorn, which is our hedgerows are dominated by those species. But for instance, if you were to look at a hedgerow that was completely made up of beech, I think perhaps you'd get very different sequestration rates because they grow much more slower than hawthorn and blackthorn hedge. But I think, as Sophia said, with the comparison of the data that is available out there, that's coming from Northern Europe and a little bit in this country in Ireland, the sort of ballpark figures of 30 to 40 tonnes of carbon per hectare for a mature hedgerow that's managed is similar across these areas.
Yeah, really interesting, thank you. Another good question here. To what extent is what's going on below hedgerows indicative of what happens in undisturbed natural ecosystems? So how does it compare to rewilding entire fields, moors and forests and agroforestry that I know you've done some work on?
Well, that's a great question. I imagine more research is done, but I mean, it's a really good question because like what that's showing really is that when you plant a permanent woody vegetation onto the soil, you're definitely getting much more litter return and cycling of the carbon that builds up, and it reaches a new equilibrium. Yeah, so you see this build-up occur for a period of time, and then it reaches a new equilibrium. And as long as the hedgerow stays present there, then it stays like that through time. Yeah, I think if you were to let a field, you know, have shrubs in corners of fields, you'd get very similar sort of build-up of carbon in both the soil and the biomass. So there are some similarities. Obviously, hedgerows are managed and have a very different structure, as Sophia talked about, compared to planting a woodland, where, you know, you're letting the trees grow to maturity and they grow upwards. You know, you've got a very different density of carbon per area, so there are some differences, but there isn't a lot of data out there about, you know, rewilding and how that, I suppose, what that looks like. It will vary depending on locations and what you find, but
yeah, and the different practices of rewilding, I suppose, are so varied, it's hard to identify. Interesting. Yeah, thank you. And similarly related to that, did you look at the impact on carbon of different ways of using the biomass removed from hedges, and, you know, how they're managed?
No, we did not look into that. There were suggestions, for example, to potentially use the biomass that gets removed once a hedge is laid or coppiced and turn it into biochar. But we have not taken that into account. So our measures are just for the hedgerow as a linear feature present in the landscape over 40 years.
Great, thank you. Maybe time for just 2 more questions. It's like a quick question fire round at you here. Do the fields, I guess the adjacent fields meant here, also benefit from extended effects of healthy soil below the hedgerow?
yeah, this is a good question, and there has been some work again in the UK, in Wales, and also in Belgium, where they looked, and France, where they looked at the impact of the hedge out into the field and at the distance at which you see that benefit. And what you tend to find, what all these studies tend to find, by the time you sort of about 3 or 4 meters away from the hedge, or definitely by 5 meters away from the hedge, the impact on the soil has diminished. So it's actually perhaps quite a small corridor, a linear feature in a way, within the landscape, where you see this buildup of carbon and the associated benefits of improving soil health, maybe better infiltration, biodiversity within the soil is quite narrow. So you don't see the benefit way out into the fields. It's quite a narrow on each side of the hedgerow that you see the buildup. You still see some buildup of carbon. It obviously depends on the root network, but that's what I would say.
And just I think we've only got time now for just the last question, and I think two can be brought together here. So when does expanding a hedgerow become a thin woodland? And also wondered if you could comment on the impact of trees in the hedge, and do we have an idea of the carbon sequestration rate of hedgerow trees and whether they're an important feature within the hedgerow? And sorry, that was probably like 3 questions in one, but I thought it would be good to end on.
I can talk about the trees. I think that's a really, you know, great question. I should have said again, all the work we did on our hedgerows didn't contain trees. Recent paper by, again, Sophie Drexler in Germany, she looked at carbon sequestration into trees within those hedgerows. So that's a paper you could look at. They're definitely important. They grow to be bigger and obviously store more carbon. But, you know, again, we're losing trees from hedges at perhaps a faster rate than we have before, particularly with ash dieback. So in a way, to stand still, we definitely need to increase our trees in hedgerows to take account for the ones that we're losing through either disease or through, you know, storms and being blown down, or diseases. So I think there's a challenge here, and definitely the need to promote trees in hedgerows, and you can definitely do that when you're laying. You can keep a tree to grow to maturity. There's not been a lot of work on on this, but as I said, the paper by Sophie Drexler is a good example of where she's compared the carbon within the mature trees in the hedgerow compared to the shrubs beneath. And I think it's quite equal, about 50-50 in the above ground biomass. And I can't remember the other bits of the question, Sophia.
No, definitely. That's fantastic. Well, we've already overrun, so sadly we'll have to leave it there. If there are any further questions, please type them into the chat, because we will download the chat and check any questions that haven't been answered and endeavour to address those if we can. So yeah, it just leaves me to thank Pippa and Sophia. So such a fantastic talk, really interesting topic, and thank you so much for everyone's questions in the chat. I hope you enjoyed the presentation and have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.